Have you ever noticed that some people seem to get more curious as they become more successful, while the rest of us slowly become more certain? At first, it doesn't seem like a problem. After all, certainty feels like progress. You learn, you gain experience, you figure out what works. Eventually, you stop questioning so much because you think you've already found the answers. Which is why Steve Aoki confused me. If you know him, you probably know him as the DJ who's constantly touring, crowd surfing in inflatable rafts, and throwing cake into audiences. But spend enough time listening to his interviews, and a completely different person starts to emerge. Someone who's obsessed with asking questions, not just about music, about almost everything: health, sleep, nutrition, longevity, performance, learning. He's constantly testing ideas, whether that's cold plunges, tracking his sleep, analyzing his blood work, talking with longevity experts, or trying new routines to see what actually makes a difference. On the surface, it starts to look like someone who's simply obsessed with biohacking. And honestly, that's what I thought too. But the more interviews I watched, the less that explanation made sense. Because none of those habits seem to be the point. They all seem to be protecting something. The question is, what? Because if you only look at the cold plunges or the blood tests or the workouts, you're looking at the evidence, not the reason behind it. And that reason may explain far more about Steve Aoki's success than any productivity system or morning routine ever could. In fact, I think it reveals something that almost all of us slowly lose without realizing it. We'll come back to that. First, though, there was something else Steve Aoki kept doing. It was so ordinary that most people would probably overlook it. But once it became impossible to ignore, it changed the way I listened to everything else he said. One pattern showed up almost immediately. Steve Aoki almost never talks about optimization the way most people do. He isn't chasing the perfect morning routine or the perfect diet or the perfect workout. If anything, he seems much more interested in finding out what's actually factual. That sounds like a small difference. I don't think it is. For example, Steve has talked about tracking everything from his sleep to his blood work to his biological age. At first, that sounds like someone who's obsessed with health. Except, there was one problem with that explanation. He doesn't collect information to prove he's right. He collects information to find out if he's wrong. That's a completely different mindset. Most of us gather information the way lawyers do. We're trying to defend the version of ourselves we already believe. Steve seems to gather evidence like a scientist. He's trying to discover something he doesn't know yet. The more interviews I watched, the harder it became to explain everything with biohacking alone. When he talks with doctors or researchers or longevity experts, he doesn't sound like someone who's looking for people to agree with him. He sounds like someone who's genuinely fascinated that they might know something he doesn't. And that's unusual, especially for someone who's already achieved so much. It raises an interesting possibility. Maybe we've been thinking about success backwards. Most of us assume that as people become more successful, They become more certain. They've learned, they've experienced, they've earned the right to trust their instincts. But Steve seems to have gone the opposite direction. The more successful he's become, the more questions he asks, not fewer. And then I came across something else. Whenever one experiment doesn't produce the results he expected, he doesn't seem disappointed. He adjusts. He tries something else, and he keeps going. There isn't this emotional attachment to being right. There's just curiosity about what happens next. That may not sound remarkable at first, until you compare it with how most of us approach ourselves. Think about how often we say things like, "I'm just not disciplined. I'm not creative. I've never been good at mornings. I already know what works for me." Those don't sound like conclusions. They sound like facts. We stop investigating. The case is closed. Steve seems to operate as though the case is never closed, which points to a bigger possibility. Maybe the biggest difference between people who keep evolving and people who quietly stop isn't intelligence or discipline or even motivation. Maybe it's something much easier to miss, because if Steve Aoki is protecting anything, I'm no longer convinced it's his health. I'm starting to think it's something much less obvious. And then one conversation, almost hidden among everything else I watched, changed the way I understood everything I'd seen up to that point. Steve Aoki was talking about longevity, not about living forever, not about even living longer. He was talking about staying capable, about being able to keep creating, keep performing, keep learning, keep showing up for the work he loves. And suddenly, all those habits I'd been looking at individually started making sense together. The cold plunges, the blood work, the sleep tracking, the conversations with experts, the endless experiments. None of them were really about proving he'd found the answer. They were all ways of making sure he didn't stop asking questions. Everything suddenly pointed in the same direction. And that's where the story stopped being about Steve Aoki, because somewhere along the way, many of us quietly make a trade. We trade curiosity for certainty, not because we decide to, but certainty feels earned. You've done something long enough, you've learned enough, you've lived enough. At some point, you stop asking whether your conclusions are still true. You simply start living from them. I'm just not disciplined. I'm not the kind of person who, I already know how this ends. Those statements don't usually feel limiting. They feel accurate, but sometimes they quietly stop fitting who we've become. Not because we change overnight, because life keeps giving us new evidence. The question is whether we're still collecting it. That's what I think Steve Aoki has been protecting all along. Not his health, his ability to remain curious, his willingness to let new evidence challenge old conclusions, to keep asking, what if there's something I don't know yet? And that's when this stopped feeling like a story about Steve Aoki. It started feeling like a story about the rest of us, because most of us haven't lost our ability to grow. We've just become incredibly loyal to an older version of ourselves, an older conclusion, an older explanation, a case we closed years ago. Maybe the next version of your life isn't waiting for more discipline or more confidence or another breakthrough. Maybe it's waiting for one question you haven't asked in a long time. What if that isn't true anymore? Because the people who keep evolving don't seem to protect their answers, they protect their curiosity. If you're watching this and you need some one-on-one conversation with me where we can flesh out what you're dealing with, join my school community. The link is in the description. And please share this video with someone who's been having this same conversation with themselves. I'll see you in the next one.